A lot of the Constitution's critics have always liked to say that it's a relic, that it's not suitable for our time. We've actually been hearing that for 150 years. And the Constitution has proven itself to be much more alert to the dangers that a democratic republic faces than its critics ever have. It's especially alert to the most significant danger we face. How can a diverse society govern itself? The Constitution is an extraordinarily sophisticated answer to that question. There have always been critics who want to say, well, we should move faster, this slows us down too much. The Constitution says if you want to move, you need to build a broader coalition. You can't move with a very narrow majority. So the sorts of critics who say this is too much of a straitjacket ultimately are defending narrow majorities and refusing to broaden them, refusing to reach out beyond the narrow circle of people they agree with and build a broader coalition. I think the Constitution is smarter than they are about what it takes to hold our society together. It's important to understand really what unity is and isn't in American political life. There's a tendency for our politicians to talk about unity as if it just means everybody agreeing with them. And sure, if everybody agreed with me, the country would be unified, but that's not really an option in American political life. The Constitution starts from the premise that that's not going to happen and works toward an understanding of unity that means not thinking alike, but acting together. And the difference between thinking alike and acting together is that ultimately you can act together on common problems even through disagreement, by building coalitions, by bargaining and negotiating. And that's where the Constitution wants to drive us, toward a politics of coalition building, where we don't all have to agree about everything in order to address the big problems that we have in common. Process matters enormously because process shapes us as citizens. Process is a way of expressing our commitment to one another's dignity. It's a way of saying, I know what I want and I'm going to work to achieve it, but I recognize that ultimately you're my equal and you want something else, and that means I have to respect your rights if my rights are going to be respected. Politics can't just be about the end product, it has to be about how we treat each other along the way too. I think our ability to have cohesion has been diminished. It's been diminished because we've neglected the Constitution and because we've neglected the institutions that allow us to work together across lines of difference. We tend to think of ourselves as more divided than we are, and that becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. We think we have nothing in common with the people we disagree with and therefore no way to work with them. And so we've lost some of the knack for building coalitions and for finding agreement across lines of difference. And I worry for the Constitution, I worry for the country as a result. I think the way to recover from that place is to restore our understanding of what the Constitution can offer us and of how it might be possible for us to work through its institutions to help us address our problems. There's no question we've lost some of our ability to do that. I think that in the coming years we're going to have to think a lot about executive power. And one useful way to think about it is that the president really does command the executive branch, but the executive branch doesn't command our government. And so a dispute over executive power, if the question is the president allowed to hire and fire, is the president allowed to use an administrative agency in a particular way, the answer is likely to be yes. If the question is the president allowed to ignore a congressional appropriation, is the president allowed to close down a congressionally created agency, the answer is probably no. And the current Supreme Court is really committed to a maximalist view on both grounds. The unitary executive, the executive branch is run by the president, but also the separation of powers and the idea that ultimately our system is actually most accountable to Congress. These can seem like contradictory views sometimes, but they actually both serve the same ideal of the Constitution. I think we should be careful in describing our situation as a constitutional crisis. It's a term that we should save for a real emergency. It has to mean something, and I don't think we're in a place where we can say that. A lot of our constitutional politics is a matter of action and reaction. We've seen a lot of actions from the president so far, and the question of what reactions are going to look like is still an open question. So I think it's much too soon to talk about constitutional crisis. We have to see how the system responds to the pressures it's under. It makes sense to worry in a moment like this when there's a lot of pressure being put on the system. I don't think it makes sense to panic in this moment. We're not in a place where the fundamentals of the system are being undermined. We're in a place where the structure is being challenged. And that happens on a fairly regular basis in the American system of government. I will say, living in Washington for a quarter century, I've had the opportunity to go to every presidential inauguration since 1996. And the striking thing about doing that is that you find yourself 4 years having passed thinking, that was quick. Here I am again, watching this happen again. These things move fast, and we are not in a permanent new place in our system. We're going to see. There's going to be a lot of pressure on the system, and it's going to matter, and it'll make a difference, but it'll also pass. And it's important to see what endures and what changes in the American constitutional system. I think it's much too soon to say that something fundamental has been changed. Utah is an extraordinary place. It's a very conservative place, but it's also a place where political culture does value openness and accommodation. And I think that begins from a commitment to decency, a fundamental view that how things are done matters almost as much as what things are done. And I think that that is an insight that we really should work to import into our national political culture. I've known Governor Cox for a few years, and we think alike on a lot of important questions, and so I've really come to admire him. I have to say he's my favorite governor in America. A lot of what he's doing is about how to solve problems as much as which problems to take on. It's about finding ways to bring people along wherever it's possible, to broaden coalitions, to speak to people who disagree with him in ways that take them seriously, even if when they ultimately reject their views. I think that kind of approach to political culture, rooted in a sense that we have to respect each other, is really essential, and it's unfortunately become pretty rare. I think of optimism as basically an equivalent vice to pessimism. Those are both ways of saying whatever's going to happen is going to happen, and maybe you think it'll be good, maybe you think it'll be bad, but it's not about you. And in the middle, between those two vices, is the virtue of hope. Hope says this could go well if we are up to it, and it demands something of us. It's an active virtue. So I think pessimism and optimism are both mistakes. They're related mistakes. And the way to avoid both of them is to operate from a place of hope where you're not sure things will go well, but you believe they can, and you think at least in some measure it's up to you. My hope for America is that my kids can inherit a country as healthy and promising as I was able to. Ultimately, that's the obligation every generation has to the one that follows it. That's the nature of hope in America. I am hopeful. I get to be an American, so I have a lot of reasons to be hopeful and optimistic. But ultimately, I think it's enormously important that we recognize that that hope imposes obligations on us, that the desire to leave our kids a stronger, healthier country means that we've got work to do.